Hello, welcome to my basement. I am Pastor Bill Hennessy, pastor at North Presbyterian Church in Williamsville, New York. And during this time of separation that we're all experiencing, I am providing a daily Bible study and using the daily lectionary readings for that. These are found on the PCUSA website, pcusa.org. So if you're interested in seeing them all, you're welcome to go there. And if you search daily lectionary readings, you'll find the passages that I draw from. I don't use every passage. I look at just one each day and just try to focus a little bit on that passage. Today, we are looking again at Matthew's Gospel. We looked at it for a little while, and then I switched to there were a couple of passages from 1 Samuel, but that seems to have run its course in this lectionary cycle. So looking now back to the Gospel of Matthew, and this is from Matthew 8, verses 28 to 34. When he came to the other side, to the country of the Gadarenes, two demoniacs coming out of the tombs met him. They were so fierce that no one could pass that way. Suddenly they shouted, "What have you to do with us, Son of God? Have you come here to torment us before the time?" Now a large herd of swine was feeding at some distance from them. The demons begged him, "If you cast us out, send us into the herd of swine." And he said to them, "Go." So they came out and entered the swine. And suddenly the whole herd rushed down the steep bank into the sea and perished in the water. The swineherds ran off, and on going into the town they told the whole story about what had happened to the demoniacs. Then the whole town came out to meet Jesus. And when they saw him, they begged him to leave their neighborhood. That's it. That's the whole story. Kind of a strange version of that story. In fact, we find it in both Mark and Luke. As I've mentioned before, Matthew, Mark, and Luke are the synoptic gospels. They're all seen together. And Mark, of the three, is probably the earliest gospel. So the other two, Matthew and Luke, have drawn on Mark's gospel. So kind of imagine a writer with that gospel next to him or her, and using that as the source material, as sort of a primary source material, and then embellishing and adding to what is found there from other sources. And it seems that the writer of Matthew had some sources that were unique to that writer, and the writer of Luke had some sources that were unique to that writer, so that you have sort of the whole of Mark's gospel embedded in both Matthew and Luke, but then other material that isn't in either, that isn't shared by either of them, but is unique to each of them. So this is a story that is in Mark's gospel, it is in Luke's gospel, and it's in Matthew's gospel. But it's very different in Matthew's gospel from the other two. In both Mark and Luke, there's only one demoniac, and he is in the, and it's referred to as the garrison, not Gadarene. So you've got a sort of a difference of place, which it could be a typo, sort of a clerical error on the part of some scribe at some point in the recopying of Matthew's gospel, possibly, or maybe it's meant to refer to a different region. It's not entirely clear about what that is, what that discrepancy is meant to convey. If it's in fact a discrepancy, or if it's intentional. Um, and it's much shorter in Matthew's gospel than in the other two. In the other two, there's sort of a dialogue that occurs between Jesus and the man who is possessed. And there's a lot more sort of color to the story and it's a kind of in many ways a more interesting story in Mark and Luke. For whatever reason, the writer of Matthew did not feel the need to elaborate at all and really cut down this story considerably from what exists in Mark's gospel. I suppose it's possible that the story that is, as it's told in Matthew's gospel, is an earlier version of it. Generally speaking, a shorter version is regarded as an earlier one, and longer versions are elaborations that have occurred over time through the work of later scribes. So, I mean, it is possible that that's the case. However, in Matthew's gospel, there is also this tendency to sort of double what is told. So, it's one demoniac, one person possessed by a demon, and in Mark's gospel becomes two people possessed by demons in Matthew's gospel. There may be some symbolic significance to that as well. And it's something of of a mystery to scholars, but the basic story is still here, and Gadarene would be still in a Gentile territory, and we kind of know this already because, in fact, there's a herd of swine. You would not obviously find a herd of swine among Jewish folks. So it must be a Gentile population here. Couple of things happening. These possessed people, these two people who are possessed, have a reputation. They are known. They live among the tombs, that is, in the cemetery, the local cemetery. So, in a sense, you might refer to them as the Walking Dead. They have no place of their own. They have been either exiled to the cemetery or are living in that place because by choice they have not felt desire to live anywhere else. But they don't let anyone come through either, so that's a problem, obviously. And they confront Jesus and know immediately, and this is a typical in the Gospels, demons and evil spirits tend to know who Jesus is immediately. And often, in Mark's Gospel certainly, Jesus will silence them and prevent them from identifying him as the Son of God. In this case, that doesn't happen. In this case, you've got the demon sort of, what do you have to do with me? And refers to this, have you come here to torment us before the time? Before the time. The time meaning, I assume, the time of God's redemption or retribution, in their case, I suppose. Time is, in Greek, there are two, I only know of two, there may be a third, words that are translated in English as time. One is chronos, and that refers to sort of physical linear time. So it's now 1 o'clock in the afternoon, and that is, that's an example of chronos. It's specific and limited. The other word that is translated as time is kairos. Kairos, it means sort of significant time, as in the moment. So when we talk about, it's time for a change. That is, it's the kairos. That's not referring to the time of day. It's referring to the time of when the time is ripe, sort of, and that's what kairos referred to, and that's the word here, before the time. Torment us before the time, that is, before the end of all things. So these are demons who are aware of Jesus' identity and of sort of the purposes of God in the world, and Jesus doesn't take the bait. He doesn't engage them at all. They ask for a favor. Let us go into that herd of swine. Don't just cast us into nothingness. And he says, okay, go. And that's all he says, just go. Doesn't say silence, and doesn't say be gone, doesn't, just go. And that's all it takes. And so on the one hand, you have Jesus portrayed as having, absolute power over these forces of evil. And it's not even, doesn't even require any effort. It is just second nature to him to be able to cast these demons out. He has complete authority over them. So on the one hand, you've got, the author of Matthew is sort of, I think, highlighting that feature, that quality of Jesus. So that's being established. And then you have this encounter between him, Jesus, and the community. So he restores these people back to normal. They're no longer possessed by demons, so they're no longer a threat. They have been, thoroughly, tamed, as it were. And the people who are keeping the swine, the pigs, the swine herds, is that right? They run to the town and say, look, you won't believe what happened. And tell everybody what's going on. Maybe also to explain that this is why we no longer have a herd of swine. Probably it does not belong to them. So they aren't, apparently too broken up over that, oddly. But they are excited about what they just saw. And the people come out, and they see Jesus with these two men, presumably. I assume they're both men. It does it say a little story about what happened to the monarchs? Yeah, I think they're assumed to be male. At any rate, these two people who have been possessed are calm and they're good. But that's not described in this gospel. But they see what's going on and they just beg Jesus to leave, which is interesting, right? You need to get out of here. We don't need trouble. We don't need, you just need to move on, please. It's interesting how resistant or reluctant or afraid they are to have anything to do with this kind of authority. what is that trying to convey? And it's interesting too that well, in this case, we aren't told, but in Mark and in Luke's Gospels, we're told Jesus doesn't have an argument with that at all. He just leaves. He says, "Okay, you know." There's no sort of remonstrance at all. He doesn't seem upset by that, which, you know, he's not trying to push himself on anybody, and he's not going to sort of coerce his presence, and that's sort of an interesting and important feature or, you know, quality of Jesus' ministry as well. He does not coerce himself on others. He simply offers, and, you know, it's there for the taking, and some people will take it and some will not. And it's interesting that, you know, those who don't, often it's not because they don't know what he's offering. It's sometimes, as in this case, seems to be because they do know what he's offering and they want nothing to do with it. So that's fascinating to me, fascinating aspect of this story. So on the one hand, it could indicate that it's just not time for this message to be received by the Gentile world. That will come, but not now. So perhaps that's what the writer is trying to convey at this point. It could be that he's simply stuck with a story that he didn't know quite what to do with, and sort of downplayed it as much as possible, because this is not, again, it's there's so little elaboration in this story. There's much more in the other, and in the other version, which are Luke and Mark, are almost entirely identical. The other version, the person who is healed wants to come with Jesus, you know, asks to go back with him, and Jesus refuses, says, no, you stay here, tell people what's happened, what was done for you, what God has done in your life. And in both cases, what he does is he goes back to tell what Jesus has done. So the person healed attributes all of this to Jesus' activity in his life. Jesus tells him to attribute it to God. So, you know, over and over, Jesus deflects credit for what he's doing, and that, again, is a common dimension of Jesus' ministry. He does not seek to be extolled or exalted or in any way even recognized for what he's doing. So he's not seeking to be in the sort of limelight. So an interesting story, and one that is sort of almost an aside, but shows, I think, how Jesus' presence is being felt beyond the Judean population. You know, in the Gentile areas of Judea. It may seem odd, that there are these Gentile pockets of populations in this part of the world, but of course, you know, the Greeks colonized throughout that area, and the Romans later. So there's been a Gentile presence in Judea for a very, very long time. And for the most part, they simply live separate lives, Jews and Gentiles. But occasionally these things intersect. And in this case, in the case of the Gospels, you see Jesus moving sort of back and forth between those two worlds. And they really were separate worlds. They may have had to share certain um, things in terms of, the Roman presence, and so they had to interact from time to time. But ordinarily, these two groups they had very little to do with one another, by design, to a certain degree, I'm sure. Jesus moves back and forth, and one of the aspects of the gospel is it is not contained in the Jewish world. It seems to be constantly pushing at the boundary, and you get hints of that throughout the Gospels, and in Luke's Gospel, that then is demonstrated in the second volume, which is the book of Acts. So, but all the Gospels seem to sort of anticipate that this is not going to end here, that the gospel is going to move out. And this is one little venture into the Gentile world, and it is rejected, resisted, not wanted. Please get out of here. So, fascinating little story. And maybe it does raise the question of how we present ourselves to the world beyond our own. If we are resisted, do we simply walk away? That seems to be the model. Unfortunately, that's not been the practice for many Christians. But in this case, that's what's happening. Jesus isn't going to coerce himself on this community. They simply want him to go, and he's willing to do that. And yet, leaving behind healing, leaving behind a story of a moment when God's presence came near, when the kingdom drew near, and two people in this case, were healed, were made whole. So that wholeness occurs regardless of its reception by others. So, a number of things to maybe derive from that story. I encourage you to read it yourselves and to compare it to the others as well. It's really an interesting thing to see them lined up side by side, and maybe you'll discern some deeper meaning from this encounter as well. So, friends, I hope your day is a good one, and that you continue to remain safe and whole, and that you are experiencing today, as every day, the peace of God's presence in your life. Be well.